So hello everyone, welcome to CMAG. So wonderful to see you all here on this cold winter's night. My name is Sophie Chessel. I am Acting Director here at CMAG while Shane begins his PhD at ANU, which is a place that features significantly in the story that you're hearing tonight. I'm just here to welcome you, also to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ACT, the Ngunnawal people. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. CMAG is so pleased to be hosting this panel to mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Homosexual Law Reform Society in association with our exhibition, our new major exhibition, Activism, Forces for Change in Canberra. And I'd like to actually invite the Chief Minister, Andrew Barr, to come up and say a few words.
Thank you very much and good evening, everyone. Can I begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather this evening, Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge all of our distinguished guests, our very distinguished panel, who we look forward to hearing from shortly. And friends, tonight is the important occasion of marking 50 years since the formation of Australia's first organisation for homosexual rights, the Homosexual Law Reform Society of the Australian Capital Territory. This is an important occasion, and if I get the order of my speech right, we are able today to thank four groundbreaking activists who, in a meeting held 50 years ago, just across the road, I'm told, in a building on Ainslie Place, helped pave the way towards improved rights and the improved rights and increased acceptance that we now experience today. The formation of the society served as a lightning rod nationally for those concerned with the issue of homosexual law reform. It's important to note that the society was not a gay group, nor was it concerned with issues other than decriminalisation. But it drew on reform policies and politics centred on the notion of civil liberties and the activism of civil libertarians. So tonight I particularly want to thank Thomas, Peter, James and Elizabeth for standing up that day 50 years ago, and also acknowledge the role of people who aren't here tonight. People like Michael Landale, a solicitor who I'm advised was the original force for change in founding the society. As we hold this event this evening in association with the exhibition Activism, Forces for Change in the ACT, it is important to acknowledge all of the reformers and activists who, over many decades, have secured the building blocks of legal equality, from anti-discrimination protections to relationship recognition, and most recently, in our nation, the right to marry the person we love. I also acknowledge the people who responded to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s, which decimated our community when it had only just begun to emerge from the darkness. And I thank those HIV activists today who understand that this struggle is indeed not over. To the trans and gender diverse activists who continue to confront discrimination and violence, who've done so for decades but who are proudly standing up now for their rights. Similarly, to intersex advocates who continue to fight for their human rights and for their bodily integrity. And to queer people of colour, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander LGBTIQ people who face additional challenges of discrimination. For those who do fight, who do stand up for their rights, we know that this takes a toll. It's physically and psychologically exhausting work. It's mentally and financially draining. Tonight is an opportunity to come together and say thank you for all of those who've contributed to making this world better for all of us. So 50 years on, we recognise the fight continues to ensure equality, to ensure fairness, and to ensure that this is a reality for all LGBTIQ people. And I have to say, here in the ACT, we have a very strong record of progressive reforms. 30 years of self-government has indeed proved that that chamber across the road has stood up for fairness and equality time after time. We are building Australia's most inclusive community, inclusive for all people regardless of their sex, their gender or their sexuality. And we're doing this through the implementation of our Capital of Equality strategy, which lays out the roadmap for Canberra to be the most LGBTIQ+ welcoming and inclusive city in this nation. And throughout this year, 2019, we're highlighting our history, we're celebrating our achievements, and we're recognising the contributions of queer people throughout our community. And there are a significant number of events. I won't list them all tonight, you'll be pleased to hear, but I do want to highlight a few. The Out and Loud Choral Festival from the 24th to the 28th of October at a series of Canberra's iconic venues that will bring together hundreds of LGBTIQ singers, their partners, their families from across our nation, New Zealand and the Indo-Pacific region to share in the joy of singing, drawing inspiration and learning from each other. We have the annual Australian Gay and Lesbian History Conference to be held in Canberra at the ANU on the 15th and 16th of November, which will see hundreds of delegates from across Australia and the world gather in our city. And in November, it will be the 20th anniversary of Spring Out, Canberra's very own Pride Festival, which will be a celebration of our city's vibrant, inclusive and thriving culture. A new book written by Graham Willett on Canberra's very queer history will be released this year, and the panellists here tonight form an instrumental part of that history. And over the next 12 months, we will see the results of the wide range of projects that we funded through the ACT Government's grants program. So in conclusion, the incredible progress that has been made in the ACT has been achieved because of the work of many individuals and many organisations. Today, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, and we give our thanks to the 4 panellists who've made our city a better place, we should also take a moment to reflect on what each of us can do, what we should do, what we must do to carry on the work of the activists who've come before us. Thank you all for being here tonight, and I'll now hand you over to the panel.
I want to add my acknowledgement to the traditional custodians and Ngunnawal people of the land, and to remember in particular the histories of oppression and resistance that have done so much to shape this part of the country. My name is Graham Willett, and I'll be chairing tonight's discussion. I'm a historian of gay and lesbian Australia, and more recently, as things have started to change a little bit, about bisexual, trans, intersex, gender diverse, Q+ histories as well. I've been doing this work since 1979 when I first came out. I first stumbled across the Homosexual Law Reform Society of the ACT in the very early 1990s when I started work on my history of the gay and lesbian movement as a PhD, and then published later as Living Out Loud by Allen and Unwin in 2000. I have to say I didn't imagine I'd still be talking about this 25 years later. And I dare say our panellists didn't imagine that they would be talking about it 50 years after they started doing their work. My job here is just to give a little background to help people understand where the organisation came from. In 1969, it was against the law for men to have sex with each other, and sex was defined very broadly there. It was also against the law for men to proposition each other to have sex. It was also against the law for a man to hang around in a public place on the off chance somebody might wander past who they could proposition for sex. These were laws that were both stupid and unjust, and not surprisingly, and rightly in my view, many men defied them. But they were not dormant laws. On the contrary, the police in the ACT were active in seeking out offenders and prosecuting them. As late as the early 1960s, we have newspaper reports, complete with names and addresses, I might add, of men who were arrested in public places in incidents that we would describe as police entrapment. On one occasion, for example, a man asked another man whether he was a cop. The other man evaded the question, but when he felt a hand on his leg, he revealed that yes, he was a cop, and the man was arrested. And to give you some idea of what it might mean to be arrested and exposed in the media like this, we have the case of the man who was charged with both indecent assault on a male, which was the usual charge, and with attempting to commit suicide. Same day, same court case, same hearing. Another stupid and unjust law that we could have done without. And so it was that when person A and person B, not their real names, were found each other at the public toilet at Garema Place one night in February 1969, they decided it would be wiser to go somewhere a bit more private. They got in a car and drove out to the quiet dirt road near Yawani Golf Course, which is up north a bit. Just as things were getting interesting, a police car pulled in behind them. They were both arrested. And then something odd happened. When they came to trial, person A was acquitted, but person B was sentenced to 2 years jail. Again, same incident, same offence, but two very different outcomes. This striking fact, reported in the pages of the Canberra Times, caught the attention of a number of people, among them Dr. Thomas Mautner, and that's really where our story begins. There were at this time people who were starting to question these laws. Bill Hayden, for example, spoke of the need for decriminalisation in an early speech to Parliament in the 1960s. And when the Law Council published a draft criminal code for the ACT in 1969, it was widely criticised for proposing to leave the laws against homosexuality in the criminal code. So there was a lot of talk, or at least a bit of talk, around these issues at the time. But the HLRS went beyond talk, it took action. The people who founded the HLRS would probably today be referred to as allies. But that doesn't really work in 1969. There was no one to be allied with. It would be a year before homosexual people began to stand up publicly for ourselves on our own behalf, with the formation of the Campaign Against Moral Persecution in Sydney, formed in mid-1970, publicly announced in September of that year. And it would be another year again, September 1971, until a Canberra branch of CAMP was formed. The HLRS was the first organisation in Australia to speak out for homosexual rights. And the public meeting that was held in Canberra on July 27, 1969, at Red Cross House on Hobart Place, gone now of course, and not therefore a site for a commemorative plaque, this should be recognised as one of the founding moments of a movement that has changed laws and attitudes beyond anything anybody could have imagined that night. And it's that organisation that we're here to hear about. Okay. So we're going to just work our way through a few of the people that were involved in the organisation in different ways. I imagine we've got enough information to keep you here till the wee small hours of the morning. But what we actually have is an hour. So we've really selected some points that people thought would be interesting to talk about. We're just going to go through the panel and ask them to reflect on different aspects. And I'm going to wave at them if they start to go over time. And then, of course, we've got time outside over drinks and snacks to interrogate each other a bit more thoroughly. We're starting with a quick survey of the panel, just to ask people really, just to briefly describe who they were back then and how they came to be involved in the HLRS. Shall we start with you?
Oh, by all means. I'm the only one who was actually paid for what I did. The others were all pro bono. I was a young journalist at the Canberra Times, 24 years of age, very inexperienced, and what I did then will come later.
I did just realise I haven't actually introduced people, so I will do that. Peter Sekuless, Elizabeth Reid, James Grieve, and Thomas Mautner. Elizabeth.
69 I was in Oxford, early 69, and I came back to Canberra and discovered a city in all sorts of swirling change going on, and it was a time when the Abortion Law Reform Association was being formed, Homosexual Law Reform Society, and others. So I I went to the public meeting, joined up with the homosexual law reform and as well as the abortion law reform. But I didn't go onto the committee or anything. My sister, Patricia Reid, went onto the committee. She was also in Canberra at that time, because I went back to Oxford to complete my degree. So then I came back mid-70, and by then there was a draft ordinance, which was again problematic in many ways, but the fight was focused very much on the draft criminal code for the Australian territories. So off we went.
Is this my 5 minutes or?
No, this is your 1 minute. Who you are and how you came to be involved.
I see, all right. Well, my name is James Grieve. In 1969, I was a lecturer in French language and literature, as it was then called, at ANU. And I was, I discovered that I was a supporter of law reforms of different sorts. And homosexual law reform was one of those, and so I joined.
Okay. Thomas.
Well, I was at that time a lecturer at the ANU in philosophy, and of course tainted or burdened, or call it what you like, by a Swedish background, and found some things here in Australia a bit strange. And what happened in this particular case was that I was out with my friend, and we saw this notice in the newspaper that these chaps had been caught by police out there and been prosecuted, and I think perhaps sentenced at that stage, I'm not sure. And then we agreed, my friend and I, that something ought to be done. And then, as usually happens, we did nothing at all. But then I was asked to help set up abortion law reform in Canberra. I ran Dennis Rose, a law lecturer. Later, he rose to some prominence, being involved in the Kemlani affair, trying to sort out what happened there. And he suggested that I see the lawyer Michael Landale, and of course I got curious. So there was then a meeting with Michael Landale and myself, and lo and behold, Peter Sekuless was there and reported it all the following day in the Canberra Times.
Miraculous.
Yes. So that's how it all started.
Thank you. Which brings us conveniently back to you, Peter.
Indeed.
To the fact that not everybody who was involved with the organisation at the time is still with us. And Peter in particular wanted to talk about the role played by Michael Landale in the organisation.
Yes, thank you, Graham. So my task this evening is to tell you about the driving force behind the homosexual law reform of the ACT, Michael Landale. He died before his time in 1996. There was that photograph's a little bit later. He was a couple of years older than me. He would have been 26, 27 at the time, and if not a grey hair to be seen. Margaret Reid, am I right? There was no grey hairs then, were there? I'm pretty sure it was very, very dark and no grey whatever. Good. Now, just let me take you back to Canberra, what Canberra was like in the second half of 1969. That's half a century ago. 3 years earlier, Harold Holt won a resounding election victory on the back of support for Australia's participation in the Vietnam War. Towards the end of 1969, Gough Whitlam achieved the huge swings, which were, of course, to lead to the its time election in 1972, not least by opposing the Vietnam War. The times they were indeed a-changing, and on commercial radio station 2GB in Sydney and 2CA in Canberra, you could hear the socially progressive broadcaster Anne Devison. I doubt if she'd get a hearing on 2GB today. There was the Anne Devison. She was interviewing Michael Landale about what we are commemorating this evening, the founding of the HLRS. And this is how she introduced the interview. But first, a word from the sponsor. Your roll tape, please.
When you open an account at the Bank of New South Wales, you open the door to Australia's largest range of financial services. So whatever your needs may be, call into the Bank of New South Wales. The friendly and experienced staff at the Wales will go out of their way to show you how their bank can help you. For the best in financial services, you can bank on the Wales.
Newsmakers, and I'm talking on that line to Canberra to Barrister Michael Landale.
Yes, indeed, you could bank on the Wales, and that jingle was nearly as familiar then as I Love Aeroplane Jelly. But for those of you who don't know, and looking around, I think most of us do, the Bank of New South Wales is now Westpac. We'll return to Michael in a minute so you can hear him describe the birth of the society far more elegantly than I could. I met Michael the previous year in the Magistrates Court while I was covering that as part of my compulsory training as a cadet journalist for the Canberra Times. We became friends, and my involvement with the formation of the society followed from that. The critical point is that Michael, like Elizabeth, as she mentioned, had recently returned from the UK, where in 1967 homosexual conduct between consenting adults in private had been decriminalised. For both Michael and Elizabeth, that experience and knowledge made what was happening in Canberra just 2 years later both shocking and abhorrent. Something had to be done, and indeed it was. A few years later, Michael followed his father Bill Landale's footsteps into foreign affairs. In a distinguished diplomatic career, prematurely cut short by illness, he achieved ambassadorial rank, including an incredibly taxing posting as Australian ambassador to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. But that's quite enough of me. Let's hear what Michael had to say. Good. You roll the tape.
This society that's been formed in Canberra, this is the first, is it, in Australia?
Well, we think it is. As far as we know, there hasn't been any other. We've been looking around, obviously, to find others to get in contact with, but I think we're the first.
And what kind of members do you have?
Well, we convened a meeting and to see who would turn up, and in fact, at the first meeting, there were about 50, and that 50, which comprised just ordinary members of the public, appointed a committee which includes a couple of practicing lawyers, a couple of academic lawyers, a reader in French at the university, and a couple of other university people.
So you have mainly academic people at the moment?
Mainly the balance is towards academics, yes.
What do you feel are the reasons for wanting the laws to be reformed?
Well, I think just putting it very simply, I think everyone in the committee is quite convinced that a homosexual has absolutely no choice about his condition, and that what he does in private, provided it's done with a consenting male over the certain age of discretion and so on, that shouldn't attract any criminal sanction. And that's really, I think, the basic motivation. We had here in Canberra a series, and have got a series of offences which are being tried and have been and will be tried in the courts, where people have been sent to prison for what really amount to consenting offences, some of them really in private as well. And we felt that this was quite wrong. The people were being sent to prison, and we felt, apart from anything else, that prison was the last place that you should send a homosexual to.
This is how you came to be involved in it, isn't it?
I was involved. I can't really say too much about it, but I was involved in a case of this sort, and in fact my client was sent to prison for 6 months. And it occurred that was really when the penny dropped as far as I was concerned. And
Thank you. So that gives you, from the archive, literally from the archive, an account for how Michael came to be involved in the whole process. We're going to move on to James now, and you're going to give us a bit of a thought on your motivations for getting involved in the organisation.
Right. Well, all I'm going to do is mention a few words and expressions which were common currency at the time, 50 to 60 years ago. The Chief Minister mentioned one of them a few minutes ago, civil liberties, and he mentioned another one, libertarianism. I'm going to mention Montesquieu, common decency, the DLP, censorship, pornography, crime without a victim, and expressions such as open the floodgates and sap the moral fibre of the nation. So civil liberties. There used to be, there possibly still is, a council for civil liberties. I was never a member, but I was always a supporter. I think Thomas was probably a member. It was a time when libertarianism still, or libertarians rather, still knew that they belonged basically to the left, because the roots of libertarianism are intermingled with the roots of anarchism. There was a time, in fact, when libertarianism and anarchism, the two words, were interchangeable. Unfortunately, nowadays, the word libertarianism has been hijacked by the hard right, and it's time people were reminded of the fact that it was possible to be a libertarian of the left.
That was a civil libertarian.
Civil libertarian, that was what the Chief Minister mentioned. Civil. Yeah. Yes, but libertarianism...
They were civil.
Well, all right, well, are you being civil to me at the moment? All right. Montesquieu gave a simple and lucid definition of freedom in the 18th century. Thomas will probably tell me that somebody had given it before him, but...
In Sweden.
No, probably much further back. That freedom is the right to do whatever the law allows, which is a very clever and cunning definition. It does imply, of course, that freedoms can be curtailed by the law, but it also implies that the law can facilitate and protect freedoms. And unfortunately, in 1969, the law didn't protect many freedoms. It saw its job as curtailing them. As for common decency, well, that was an expression that George Orwell commonly used, and I was a member of a generation born and brought up in Great Britain, nourished and nurtured, among other people, by George Orwell. And common decency, I think, was a concept that had its place and still has its place in political discourse. The DLP was, of course, a political party which saw as its original function to denounce communism in the Labour Party, and was successful in this, enabling the Labour Party not to take power until 1972 for a whole generation. Once it became implausible that there were in fact communists under our bed, the DLP needed to find other villains. And anything to do with sex was where they found it, obviously, in censorship, homosexuals, and in abortion. The three things have in common, of course, and sexual activity. Pornography was a word that was bandied about much at the time. All it really meant was erotic stimulation through works of literature or films. I first came upon the expression "a crime without a victim" through the Homosexual Law Reform Society. It was either Michael or Des O'Connor who first mentioned it in my presence. It may well have been a concept which was very familiar to lawyers, but I'd never heard it before, a crime without a victim. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what we're dealing with here. And if there is no victim, then there shouldn't be a crime. As for opening the floodgates and sapping the moral fibre of the nation, those were expressions that were used commonly, not only by the DLP, but by others who were opposed to reform of the law in matters of this sort. Their descendants are now using, if not those expressions, then similar expressions about real enemies of the state, like refugees nowadays. When I put together my belief in civil liberties and in common decency and the notion of a crime without a victim, it was, as far as I was concerned, an open and shut case. And so I joined the Homosexual Law Reform Society, and the rest, I would like to say, is history. But for some time after the end of our functioning existence, there wasn't really much history to tell.
Thank you. Thomas, you've sort of got us to the point where it's time to start the organisation. Do you want to talk a little bit about its early activities and its establishment?
Yes. Well, perhaps I could add to what James said that James Grieve actually was quite active in writing in various media, or only the student newspaper, the Canberra Times, and always with great brilliance and wit, as you would expect. As for some other recollections, well, we were there in Michael Landale's office, Peter Sekuless and I, and agreed that the Homosexual Law Reform Society should be set up. And I explained to them that I'd be involved, of course, but I should be kept in the background. I'd run the Gestetner duplicating machine and do things like that, and they would be in front publicly. And the following day, Peter Sekuless reports, 5 columns on the front page with my name explicitly mentioned. Well, as things...
I was never very good journalist.
as it was, I didn't bear much of a grudge, and we haven't actually, our paths haven't crossed for these last 50 years until now. But I couldn't really bear a grudge, because coming out in public, as I then was, Don Baker, a very fine historian at the ANU, came up in the common room that morning and shook my hand and praised me for my great moral courage. So that was nice, you know. And of course I couldn't disappoint him, tell him the real story. Anyway, then there were of course various episodes. One that I remember is when Des O'Connor and I had an audience with Tom Hughes, the Attorney General. And Tom Hughes was there assisted by a very senior public servant, Keith Edmonds. And I was then holding forth about the arguments why the law ought to be changed. And Des O'Connor also elaborated on what was wrong with the draft criminal code, which was absolutely pathetic, awfully bad, I mean, from any point of view. I think its basis was some old Queensland criminal code, so you can imagine the rest yourself. Anyway, and at one point I was holding forth a bit why the law ought to be changed, and Keith Edmonds, the senior public servant who assisted, butted in and said, look, if there is a law reform like that, parents will refuse their sons to go to Duntroon. And thereby, Keith Edmonds managed something quite unusual. He reduced me to silence completely. I didn't know what to say. I mean, a senior public servant coming up with a thing like that. I just felt silent. Fortunately, Des O'Connor moved in and kind of saved the situation. More interesting was Bill Hayden's role in all that. Once over lunch, he explained how he had once been a young Queensland policeman with very different attitudes, and he was now regretting his past, or even perhaps feeling ashamed of it. So he was quite active in supporting all this. At one point in 1971, he took an initiative in Parliament House and simply called a meeting for any interested member of Parliament, for an information meeting where we would hold forth and explain to the MPs who were interested about our ideas about law reform. Well, that meeting was set down for 7 o'clock in the evening. But in the afternoon, there was a Labour caucus, and Bill Hayden was obliged to cancel the meeting. It was considered politically unwise or something. So, well, we didn't know about that. We turned up in King's Hall about 7, and there were these Labour MPs, half a dozen of them or more, some of them in their caps, they just had dined. And one of my claims to fame is that I was then roundly scolded by Whitlam himself for being such a nuisance. Well, not just me, but all of us then. Frank Stewart, a right-wing Labour MP from Sydney, threatened to punch me on the nose. He was annoyed. And Moscass told me later that that was not necessarily a figure of speech. I then wrote a very nice letter to Frank Stewart, said that I was interested in having him develop his opinions in this matter. But I did actually get a reply which was not abusive, but he said that he declined, I can't remember the wording now, but he declined that suggestion for a meeting. So there were a few incidents like that, but I think I'll stop with that and just add as a concluding factor that the politicians were the most backward. The public, well, two things. As far as the society was concerned, there was a lot of correspondence quite early, much of it from interstate, and this was very much due to the fact that Henry Mayer, political science in Sydney, had written a column in the Australian, so that people from all over the continent wrote to us, and what we replied was that they should set up their own societies because state legislation is of course different and all that. But otherwise, just concluding by saying that the politicians were clearly the most backward. Public opinion in Canberra, but also elsewhere, was in favour of reform. All the major churches were in favour. The major media were in favour. It was only the politicians who were lagging.
Good, thank you. We've heard about the perfidious role of the media on various occasions. But Peter's here to talk a bit about the role of them. As somebody who was inside the press at the time, talk a little bit about it from your point of view.
Yes, it was, whichever way you look at it, the Canberra Times was certainly a major player in this. And having obviously, in preparing for this, recently gone back and looked at some of that coverage, I'd forgotten quite just sort of how bold and crusading they were at the time. And but let me stress, I must stress that it wasn't me. I was saying I was it was the editor and the senior editorial team who took the decisions. I was only been a journalist for about 18 months. I was not long out of my indentures as the cadetship. Cadetship was basically an apprenticeship. And so when the stories, as Thomas has said, the very first story was on the front page. As you can see, I was even then I wasn't a very good journalist. I was a complete setup. I mean, you know, I actually attended the meeting. It was quite literally, as Margaret was, I think it was called the MLC building, wasn't it? Where the Davies, Bailey and Cater offices were. So that first meeting of just Thomas, Michael and I was literally just the third floor.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry, Margaret Reid was Michael was a junior solicitor, and Margaret was already a partner of Davies. Margaret Reid was already a partner of Davies, Bailey and Cater there, specialising in family law. Yes, we were. And so it was them. It was the editors, the sub-editors, who turned my juvenile prose into journalese, and there was sort of saying there was that original story when we met at Michael's office, and then setting up the society, and then in very quick time there were on page 2, which was then the sort of that the editorial was on the editorial, and there was no such thing as an op-ed. You know, it was front page, and then page 2, but had the editorial and the sort of articles that we'd now call op-eds. And 3 days in a row, August 6, August 7, 6, 7 and 8, I think, there were major stories on sort of page 2. They really went to town on it. Thomas wrote the last one. And then they continued to publish. They gave prominence to them, and they continued to give prominence to the letters to the editor, because they literally Canberra people took this to their, I think it was the sentence. It was not only the injustice of it all, but this rather ancient judge who was famous for being pretty crusty and throwing this throwing this poor chap into prison for 6 months that really got people going. And so the letters continued to pour in, and they were given prominence. And rather to, we only just discovered, I was looking for the editorial. I'm sure there was an editorial at the time. The editorial didn't get published until Australia Day 1970. So we've got, so there was 6 months of this, of this continuing pressure. But they were not I have to say, the Canberra Times was not without its doubts in this, because when I went, the editor, and when I went first to the editor, it was considerable trepidation, because not only was it a sort of a controversial subject, but I knew that John Allen was a good Catholic. And anyway, but so they went ahead and supported this despite his qualms. And I remember him saying to me early in the piece, he said, "You've got to be careful with this, son. You could be marked for life." And indeed I have been, but not in quite the way he thought. But I think the other matter, the Canberra Times was in a sort of unique position, because it was very proud of itself, still basking in the glow of having driven Rupert Murdoch out of Canberra, because Murdoch had set up he was going to set up his national paper, which as indeed he did, and in Canberra. And so as in response, that's when the Fairfax organisation, the then mighty Fairfax organisation, which basically doesn't exist anymore, bought out the Canberra Times from the Shakespeare family, and brought out quite a distinguished editor from England, John Douglas Pringle, and financed the paper to quite a decent extent so it could compete with the Australian. And indeed, there was quite a furious it's one of the sort of famous newspaper battles of Australian history. And of course, the Canberra Times was very pleased with itself, because in 1967, Rupert Murdoch uprooted and took the Australian to Sydney. Of course, the Canberra Times was very proud of itself and thought it was its competition. I think the main problem was the Canberra fog. What happened was, of course, he had to distribute his papers throughout Australia, and so often during the winter the plane couldn't take off because of the fog. But I'm an old Canberra Times hack, and oh no, we drove him out. Now the other thing was, of course, that there wasn't sort of much else other media. And we did have a situation. And I think it took its role extremely seriously, because of course we had one member. We had only one member in the Parliament, Jim Fraser, and he was only ever allowed to vote on local matters. Was that great toothless tiger, the advisory council, going then? Yes. So we had that. We had the Canberra advisory. That might have just been anyway. There was a local advisory council. And so the Canberra Times took its sort of role as tribune of the people, very seriously. I mean, quite frankly, seriously to the point of pomposity quite often, but they certainly did. But so there we had a situation really where the ACT police, which were part of the federal government, were taking this. They were basically answerable to nobody. And this crusty old judge who was doling out these sentences. So the Canberra Times did sort of felt it was quite unreasonable then that people were being sent to prison for offences which, in our country, the UK, the country which was sort of our main point of reference, were no longer a crime. But so I guess the difference between then and now is that a local paper was able to very much lead public opinion, not just follow it.
Good, thank you. And last, but by no means least, Liz, you've got things to say about the kind of legacy of the organisation and the experience.
Yes, definitely. But I want just first of all to reinforce a point that Peter made. The first editorial in the Canberra Times was the 26th of January 1970. Now, can you imagine now, with all the jingoism associated with Australia Day, that we'd have an editorial on homosexual law reform on the 26th of January? Shows you how, and allows you to date the sort of significant changes in our society. Okay, so the first thing you might have noticed was that lots of those involved in the Homosexual Law Reform Society were from the ANU. We were a huge number. I mean, we were predominant, definitely. we were all there in our private capacities, as individuals concerned about the way the police were treating homosexuals in Canberra. But why so many from the ANU? It wasn't a specifically homosexual society, as Craig Johnson, who's a historian of the gay liberation movement, has pointed out. Some of its members were civil libertarians, as James has said, some were not. Some were members of the Humanist Society, some were not. Lex Watson summarised perhaps it best, or best for me. Lex said, "It was needed and therefore you did it." Full stop. As individuals from the ANU, there was no concerted effort amongst us, but there was a culture of activism around the ANU in those days. And it was amid the broader mood of mixed optimism and expectation that have already been talked about, in which the ALP would come close to victory later in the year, but not get it for another 3 years. And so with that later election in October of '69, there were a new cohort of quite enlightened ALP members of Parliament and senators who came to Parliament, such as Moss Cass and Senator John Weldon from Western Australia. And we knew that if reform was to be achieved through Parliament, it stood a much greater chance of being achieved with ALP support than with support from the then Liberals, the Country Party or the DLP. Now, Peter's mentioned the role of the Canberra Times. I want to also mention the role of Woroni. Woroni was the newspaper of the ANU, Students' Association, and it was the most vibrant paper, absolutely amazing as a paper. It came out irregularly, that is, I think it was due out once a week, but in some months you got 7 or 8 issues of Woroni. Whenever you had something to say, Woroni would publish it. So Woroni published back in 69, 70, 71. James was writing on homosexual law reform. There were articles on the draft criminal code for the Australian Territories, which was scandalous code as a draft code. Then come the election in 72, and there were David Willard stood in McMahon's seat in Sydney, so there are articles on that. Pat Eatock stood in the ACT. There are articles on that. Woroni was vibrant, and it reflected, I think, the general feeling, I think, that goes part of the way of explaining. It was both a reflection of and an instigator of the sort of mobilisation of people from the ANU. Now, I want to point out and make some claim that I think that the Homosexual Law Reform Society was an important stimulus for the founding of Camp Inc. Now, why do I say that? Because it turns out that Lex Watson was there on the 20th. Now, I'll get to who Lex Watson is in a minute, but Lex Watson was there on the 27th of July at that meeting. He just happened to be in Canberra from Sydney. And he was there on the weekend of the formation of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, and he joined up. He then attended a public meeting in Sydney, organised by the Humanist Society, which formed a homosexual law reform subcommittee, and he became a member. And then, of course, he and Sue Wills went on to form Camp Inc. So I think that was a very interesting thing. Now, the work of the Homosexual Law Reform Society on a draft ordinance, seeking to repeal the provisions of the Crimes Act of 1900, which is what the homosexual law at the time was, led the Society inevitably to work on the broader draft criminal code for the Australian Territories. Yes, there was, and particularly on a number of, particularly as a number of the HLRS committee and ordinary members were also active on issues such as abortion, rape within marriage, prostitution, and so on. There was much lobbying of parliamentarians and church leaders, writing of articles on law reform, letters to the Canberra Times. It's all been mentioned. And other forms of activism. Thomas has talked about going to lunch with the parliamentarians and so on. Meetings were held with Attorneys General and the Shadow Attorney General, and a meeting was held in November 1971 with interested parliamentarians. 80 members of the ALP and one Liberal, Jim Salmon, turned up. So activism around issues such as homosexual law reform and abortion made people, including decision makers, aware of matters that they had preferred to be unaware of, including the importance of freedoms in ordinary life. This activism changed us, just as it changed others. It changed us, the people on the committee. We became better informed. We took the knowledge and empathy we gained into our work. And here I just want to point out what I think to be some of the flow-on benefits of all that activism around this issue. So I went on and joined, as you know, the staff of the Prime Minister of Australia. And when the government wanted to effect change in the area of the workforce, it could directly affect change in the Commonwealth Public Service. Anywhere else, it all had to be negotiated and it took time. So, quite quickly into the Whitlam years, the word spouse was redefined to include unmarried partners. And benefits now started flowing to partners, including in same-sex relationships, as well as to the married ones. And the ANU followed suit very quickly. So it had that sort of flow-on benefit. For the first time in foreign affairs, if you were posted overseas, all the benefits that your married spouse got in terms of airfares to join the spouse, reassignment benefits and so on, they become available to the unmarried but long-term partners of the bureaucrats. And then Whitlam set up a Royal Commission on Human Relationships, which I think was involved in absolutely radical change in attitudes and awareness in the Australian population. This is 1974. And that Royal Commission arose because of a failed motion in Parliament on abortion. So initially it was called a Royal Commission into Male and Female Relationships. But it was clear that it had to be broader than that. And so it was argued to Whitlam that if we were going to have a Royal Commission, it had to be on all human relations, all interpersonal relationships. And it was. And so for the first time, or yet, well, not one of the first times what that Royal Commission did was it created safe spaces within which gay and lesbians could come and tell the stories about the realities of their lives. And it was absolutely amazing, the stories that were told and the changes that occurred. One of the recommendations of the Royal Commission was that the Public Service Board should set an example to employers generally in Australia by implementing a policy of non-discrimination against homosexuals and similar minorities. Very interesting. Thus, in 1978, the EEO Commissioner, Gail Radford, with the explicit backing of ASIO and Foreign Affairs, introduced a policy of non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And they got that backing from ASIO and Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular because of blackmail. So that was interesting, and we can carry on then into the work in Australia on the HIV epidemic. It was all infused with all of those principles and the empathy and the knowledge of those days. Is there work still to be done that comes from the actual work of directly from the work of the Homosexual Law Reform Society? Well, I think so myself. in preparing for this talk, I looked up the 2015 Historical Homosexual Convictions Extinguishment Act, which was introduced, wherein people who'd been found guilty of homosexual convictions could apply to have their convictions extinguished. And I must say, I was somewhat appalled by that. When I look back and think of the scene, the homosexual scene in Canberra in 1969, who was involved and what it was like, I think it would be very difficult for some people, either because of status or position, public positions, or because they'd fled from the ACT because of persecution and guilt and blame and everything. I think it'd be very difficult for them to actively apply to have their convictions extinguished. And I think we need to raise the issue yet again of why it couldn't have been an opt-out policy rather than an opt-in policy. Thank you.
Okay, we've run a little bit over time, but not nearly as much as we could have, let me tell you. But let's take a couple of questions anyway. We'll just hold you off on the food and drink. We've got a microphone, so if somebody wants to ask a question, make a comment, admit their role in all of this, feel free. If this was university, I'd say we're not leaving the room until people start the discussions.
So I'll just start the ball rolling. What happened with the draft criminal code?
Anyone know?
It did become law, yes. But hopefully that particular draft, it was scandalous. It made more sexual acts or sexual conduct between homosexuals criminal than it was under the Crimes Act of 1900. It allowed rape within marriage to go absolutely without, it didn't make that a crime at all. I mean, if men were married to the women they raped, they had every right to rape them. It didn't extend rape to protect men who were raped by men, and so on. It was scandalous, but eventually I noticed there was an ordinance that was introduced when the ACT Parliament was established that covered the areas that hadn't been covered by other law reform. So homosexual law reform is explicitly covered, but other areas are covered in.
Yes, homosexuality was decriminalised in 76 by that ordinance, and then in 1985 was revisited as a part of review of the whole thing,
yes,
to bring the age of consent down to be the same as it was for heterosexuals. So it dropped from 18 to 16. But then, as we say, you think, well, that's it done then. But then the whole question of expungement comes up, and apologies and so on. So even just the little area, the single little area of decriminalisation has a way of sprawling well beyond what people would have expected at the time. I should say that the HLRS had a proposed age of consent of 18, which was 3 years younger than Britain's law at the time. So it was already more progressive than the British model. And that was felt to be what was possible at the time. Anyone else? There we go.
I can speak lately enough. Can I just ask, do we in fact know anything about what happened to the two chaps who made the mistake of driving out to the one country club?
The short answer is no. We have their names because it was in the newspapers, but we've never seen any reference to them again.
Yes, I think at one stage when we were having a discussion, I think the four of us, we had a bit of sort of sense of collective guilt that here we are having our heads patted and everyone saying nice things about it, but what about them?
And indeed, this would set me thinking about the need to have an opt-out policy. For some reason, I believe that the man who was convicted of 6 months fled Canberra and went to Queensland. So, but so that he was symptomatic of what many people did. Canberra was a very small place. We were, 70,000 or something at the time. And you know, if you were on the beat in Tilapia Park or Greener Place or somewhere, and many senior public servants were, then your worries or fears of getting known or getting out would be huge. And I think for those sorts of reasons, I know I've actually asked the Chief Minister earlier tonight about it, and he said there were, yeah. Oh, good. Over to you.
Oh, okay. So just reading from the Hansard of the debate and the explanatory statement there, it appears to relate to privacy and the difference between a spent conviction, which must be if you have a conviction that was spent under the Spent Convictions Act. If you were seeking a working with vulnerable people assessment, you would have to publicly acknowledge that you had this conviction and it was then spent. In the context of removing these particular prior convictions, this would allow, it would be a different approach, and you would be then able to, through the application process, not have to publicly declare that you had been convicted. So you didn't have to out yourself in that regard, that you had a conviction under the previous laws, and that you could have it erased and not have it be a public erasure, if you like. And so that was the basis under which the 2015 law, and it's sort of covered in some detail in relation to the process and the reasons why in the debate in the Parliament and in the explanatory memorandum of that bill. And I was recalling that there was an issue and a reason that in the end convinced everyone in Cabinet, and it was unanimously passed in the Assembly, and that was why.
I read that explanation in the explanatory notes along with the bill, and I still think there's room for questioning.
Very happy to look at that, but as I understand, that was the reason and the legal advice and the guidance at that time.
And I think that somebody just made a very important point about the possibility of an apology. I mean, these were appalling times. And not only that, but the police in the ACT seemed to have this strident desire to work the beats. And it was appalling. I mean, we later talk about entrapment and things like this, but this was vicious. This was absolutely vicious. And they lied their way through the beats and Clovey Park and Green Place. It was awful.
Don't be surprised if you hear soon the announcement of a Homosexual Law Reform Society to take up the enduring issues. That's where we need to stop, unless anyone's got a pressing question or comment. So, Sophie, over to you.
I'll be quick because I know that I'm holding you from drinks and snacks, and also I'll just mention that our exhibition, Activism Forces for Change, is open, and our senior curator, who actually did the exhibition up in the top corner, will be in the exhibition if you have any questions, but it's also a great place to just sort of learn about other activists and just be inspired by all the amazing things that people do in Canberra, just like the panel tonight. And we do have just a little gift for everyone on the panels. Thank you so much for participating in all your work on the panel. Thank you, Chief Minister, for coming and also just participating in a bit of Chief Minister talkback. That's really great. And also, Graham, we really appreciate you being here. And just a plug for Graham's book, Acting Out, Canberra's Very Queer History, which will be launched at the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives History Conference here in Canberra in November. This book has been supported by the Office of LGBTIQ Affairs, and I'd also just like to extend a huge grateful thanks to David, who is really the mastermind behind the event tonight from the office. It's been so great to partner with you for this event. And also I'd just like to say thank you to Tiffany Cole, who's just done lots of magic fairy work in making this event come together. So thank you all so much for coming, and come and have a drink.